Le Gardien du Secret. Monica sniffled as she wiped her eyes with her bare arm. She hated this outfit. He had picked it out for her. She looked like a little girl. She wasn't a little girl. She wasn't. He sure didn't treat her like a little girl. Not with what he had been making her do. He was sick. If she could take it back, she would. She would never have believed anything that he had told her. Maybe in that way she was a child. If she had obeyed her parents' warnings and not been so naive, maybe she could have avoided this. The room was tacky in all aspects, a mix of childish and sleazy. There was a mattress in the middle of the floor where she sat. The sheets weren't even really on. More like they were draped over with the blanket and a few smelly pillows. There were curtains. The window faced a wall and had no fire escape. There were also beaded decorations all over and a toy box with stuffed animals and dolls, as well as a tea set-up in the corner. A small wardrobe held the collection of perverted costumes and outfits that he would have her wear for his customers. The rain was falling. Monica normally loved the sound and smell of rain. It wasn't the same here. The window barely opened. It was an alley window, and the garbage permeated down below. She looked over to the tea table. There was a bottle of water and a sandwich. He had brought it. The crust was cut off, and a smiley face was stamped on the white bread. He was being condescending, even now. It was pitiful. That would be all she'd get for the day. Up she got and leaned against the door. It was quiet. A quick turn of the knob, and nothing happened. It was locked, and she couldn't go through. She hurried back to the window and tried to pull it open. It was stuck so hard, so she closed it. Again, she ran to the door and listened. Nothing. Not a sound. So back to the window she went and looked as best as she could through the glass at the alleyway. This could be my chance, she thought, as her heart seemed to beat faster. She could feel the adrenaline now. She wanted to be free of her mistakes, free of the price she paid again and again, free of him. She snatched up one of the stuffed animals from the chair and threw it with a cry. In the next instant, she had the chair and swung it. The glass gave way, and she tossed the chair aside. She wasn't as high up as she had first thought, and that was a rather large dumpster. Monica swallowed hard. There was no telling what was inside all those bags. Jumping could be devastating. Then again, staying locked away in this room would eventually be the death of her. She just knew it. She gasped when she heard approaching footsteps. He was coming up the stairs. She had to jump. There was no other way. She landed on the bags. It smelled horrible, and something flew up from the material and into her eyes. It burned and startled her. She frantically tried to rub it away, but it only proved to blur her vision more. She could hear the door from her room slam open and knew she wouldn't be safe here. She had to get away. She had to run. Even if she couldn't clearly see her way through, she would have to chance it. And chance it she did. She crawled out of the dumpster and tried to navigate. She had never had the chance to really explore Paris, and even now, she would never recognize any landmarks. Everything was blurry and shadowed. She could hear the offended grunts and comments, though understood not a word of it as she pushed through the crowd and forest of umbrellas. She had a head start, and she didn't plan on wasting it. Now it was just a matter of finding a place to hide so that he could not find her and bring her back. It was a miracle. Monica wasn't entirely sure how she had managed, but she had. He hadn't found her, and she was still alive. She was soaked and her eyes burned. She couldn't tell anymore if she was crying, if her eyes watered from whatever had sprayed her, or the rain had pelted her so badly. She had no idea where she was now, but so long it was away from him, it was okay. She had no idea how she would get home. Maybe she could find an embassy somewhere. Of course, that would require her eyes to work. She wouldn't be able to read anything otherwise. Then there was the issue of reading or understanding directions. "Where am I?" she asked aloud. It was quiet, but she had hoped someone walking about in the evening would hear her. It was harder to see shapes now. There was a streetlight here and there, but she couldn't tell a person from a post at this point. "Can somebody help me?" she cried out. She regretted it instantly. She didn't want to be loud. He might hear her. She wasn't even sure if he was still searching for her. She heard someone yell back. She didn't understand what was said, but the voice was angry. She heard a few other comments. She recognized a few words here and there. She guessed a few, too. "I hate Paris," she whined. "What have I done? I'll never get home." She slid her hands back and forth along the rail. Was it an overpass? Was it a bridge? It would be so wonderful if it were a bridge. She could wash away all her pain and troubles. God wouldn't judge, would he? Would he forgive her? Understand? It grew so quiet. Just the pitter-patter of raindrops on the cobblestones and roads filled the air like the static on a television set. "I can't win," she sighed. "Even if I could go home, they'll just yell at me. This is all my fault. They'll remind me about that all the time. I'll never be allowed to do anything on my own again. They'll never trust me because I was so stupid." She caught a hiccup in her throat as the warm, salty tears mixed with the cold rain on her face. "I deserve everything I got, but I just can't face it anymore. I never listen. It finally caught up with me." She gave her head a stern shake. "No more stupid decisions. I won't be a burden to anybody anymore. Everybody can finally just forget about me and move on. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It had been a long day. Jean wanted nothing more than to get home where it would be warm and dry. He could have a nice hot cup of coffee and put his tired feet up at last. His long face was clear, save the signs of his fatigue. The raindrops pattered heavily on the umbrella he held overhead. Even with the cover, he was soaked. He hadn't been able to stay in the cover during his long day, and it seemed relatively silly to have the cover now. He patted his face with his handkerchief. It too was wet, but it still helped to remove the spray from his face of the falling rain spatter. He soon came upon the bridge, glad to see the soft lamplight from the posts. He was close now. He then caught sight of something strange. It wasn't so odd to find a soul on this bridge once in a while. It was part of the regular trek, and he was not the only person to utilize it. She was a strange sight to behold, no doubt about it. Her dress was skimpy, sleazy, and a dirty white color. She was quite a raggedy little thing, and she didn't even have the decency to have an umbrella or a poncho or raincoat. She didn't even have shoes now that he was able to get a good look at her. Curious. Very curious. Jean wanted to call out to her, but that was impossible. Instead, he argued internally whether he should bother with her or alert a policeman. He then gasped as he saw her try to climb the rail. He didn't have time nor needed the time to think before dropping his umbrella and darting towards the rail. Just as Monica stepped forward, Jean managed to wrap his arms about her waist and pull her backwards. "No!" Monica screamed. "Let me go! Let me go! I don't want to go back! Stop!" Jean tried to keep hold of her. He made shushing sounds in an attempt to calm her. It took several minutes before Monica gave up and sobbed. Jean felt sorry for her. He helped her up to her feet and retrieved his umbrella. It was then that Monica began to realize that this wasn't him. This was somebody else. "Who are you?" she asked, but she received no answer. He couldn't answer her. He simply let out a sigh and walked with her. She clung to him, desperate for his guidance. "Please, help me. I can't see. I can't understand French. I'm an American." That was certainly quite a predicament. Just by the look of her, Jean could tell that there was probably a lot more to her situation than that. He was able to understand English well enough, though it did him little good in this situation. He couldn't respond to her in French, so responding in English was just as much of an issue. Even so, he couldn't stop the feeling inside that persisted. He had to help her in some way. Jean's loft was small and cozy. It was all one large space, high above the Parisian streets. He had a small kitchen. At the end was a small washer and dryer combination, perfect for such small spaces. The living room area served as the bedroom space, with the only private area being the bathroom, which contained a ball and claw tub. It was a very modest loft. Still, it had everything that Jean needed. He could watch television, listen to music, cook, bathe, sleep, do laundry, and have a roof over his head. He needed little to be content. Monica wasn't able to pass any judgment on the new accommodations. It was all a blur to her. She reached up to wipe her eyes, only to gasp when Jean gave her hand a bit of a swat. "Hey, what was that for? My eyes itch. I got something in them." He pulled her along into the bathroom. He retrieved a fresh washcloth and wetted it. He gently urged her to lower her head. She was understandably nervous about this sort of coaxing. He had put her in positions where this would lead to her humiliation. Jean, however, was not him. When she hesitated, he had brought the cloth to her face, easing her worries. She released a sigh of relief and her muscles relaxed. She lowered her head carefully into the sink, where she proceeded to wash out her eyes. The itching and burning was gone now, but she still could see no better. "I'll probably be blind forever," she sighed. "It would serve me right, I guess." She turned to the blur that she assumed was her host. "Have you ever done things that you ended up regretting?" He took her hand and brought it to his face and nodded. She understood that, but she was a bit agitated by his communication. He obviously understood English enough to understand her words, yet he said nothing back. It was all this subtleness. "Won't you talk to me?" Jean's expression saddened a little. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze and sighed a bit. He then brought it to his throat, where he pressed it against his Adam's apple. She felt it slide under his skin as he swallowed. "You can't speak, can you?" she then asked. She could feel his head shake with a negative response. For some reason, that made her feel awkward and a little ashamed. She lowered her head and searched desperately for something to say that would fix it. "You didn't have to help me, you know," she sighed. "I don't deserve it, not after what I've done. You should have just left me there to get rid of the problem." She then let out a heavier sigh. "You don't want to hear me whine, though. Nobody wants to hear some girl complain." He reached out and placed a finger on her lips to silence her. It made her heart sink. She had been right, hadn't she? The Parisian didn't really care what was going on with some American reject. She just couldn't see the sadness in his face. He cared. He did. He was compassionate that way. Otherwise, he would have never really bothered with saving her, let alone bringing her home. However, this just didn't seem like the proper order things would have to happen. Even though he could understand, there was still a language gap, and a physical one, too. They would not communicate in a regular way. This would be the most awkward game of charades either of them could ever manage. He took her by her wrist and led her to the tub. She went with him, nervous but willing. He then placed her hand under the faucet as he tried to prepare the shower. She was a bit tense. But my clothes. She wasn't sure what to say or how. Everything seemed to play out as a little too rude in her head, and his intentions were clear, yet not clear at the same time. How did he plan for this to work? Then again, she supposed it was no worse than the horrible things he would have her do. This man was not like him, was he? At this point, did it matter? Monica took a deep breath and began to pull the dress up over her head. Jean jumped back a bit in surprise and averted his eyes. He hadn't expected her to be so sudden and bold. What on earth had happened to her? Or were Americans in general this bold? It just didn't seem the gentlemanly thing to do. He cleared his throat and left her be. He assumed she could bathe herself, even with limited sight. She knew where all her parts were, and he had already moved her hands about to give her the whereabouts of the washcloth and the soap she could use. Monica returned, wrapped in a towel about her body, and one bundling her hair, to the den/bedroom. She could hear the drone of some television show Jean was watching. It was in French, so of course she could not understand. She still couldn't even see to figure out what was happening. He had been sitting in bed and hurried to her to give her some things to wear. It was a set of his own pajamas. They would perhaps be a bit big on her, but she could be comfortable and contain a sense of dignity and modesty. He also placed the remote in her hands as he passed her. Not a word was exchanged between them. It was understood once the bathroom door shut. It was his turn now. Monica stood there in confusion for a moment before feeling confident enough to put on the clothes. They were much more comfortable, and she did feel better in them. She crawled onto the bed and made herself comfortable. She flicked through the channels aimlessly. There was no telling what she eventually ended up hearing when she finally chose a channel. It was probably a soap or some movie. It was quieter than most others and didn't sound as serious as the news shows. It would do. She could hear the shower turn on, and she began to imagine what sort of man Jean was. Even if she didn't know his name, she knew he was a man. That was evident by his lack of breasts and a prominent Adam's apple. There was also a bit of a shadow on his face. She could feel the stubble when she touched his face. She was still rather annoyed that she could not communicate with him normally, but rather this issue than previous ones. It wasn't too long before she heard the shower go silent. The door opened and a gust of hot air came her way as he returned. She tensed a little, nervous when he sat beside her. She kept her face looking down to avoid any eye contact with him, or at least what she assumed would be eye contact. He pouted a bit, but understood her evasiveness. The clothes she had worn told a story that was rather horrible in their own right. He couldn't imagine what she had gone through. He was pulled from his thoughts when he heard her stomach growl. That was quite a rumble. She blushed a little. Sorry. He needed no further sounds or coaxing. He was up swiftly, and it startled her. He hurried to his small kitchen and began to shuffle through his cabinets and refrigerator. A meal was quite a good idea. It was still early enough for that, wasn't it? Monica listened and stared blankly towards the kitchen as she heard the bustling and clanking. A part of her wanted to insist she was fine, but she knew she hadn't eaten in over a day. She hadn't touched what he had brought her. A simple, childish sandwich was nothing nutritious. She could hear pans and dishes, and immediately she knew Jean was going to cook something. She was excited to have real food after dealing with such simple snacks to keep her going. What sort of cook was Jean? Did it matter? Her mouth watered as she heard the sizzling and smelled the delicious foods. He used butter in the pan. She immediately thought of home. On such a rainy night, she would enjoy grilled cheese and tomato soup while relaxing with a good TV show. She wanted more than that now. She was starving, and it was audibly evident. She wanted to ask what he was making, but it wouldn't have done any good. He would not have been able to answer her, so all she could do was wait in agonizing anticipation. He soon returned and knelt beside her. She was a bit startled by his return, but did little to show it. It smelled so good. She pulled her head back when something touched her lips. Instinctively, she licked them and realized that they tasted good. She leaned in carefully and opened her mouth. He gently placed the forkful of food in, and she pulled off with her teeth. It was delicious, and she was eager to accept more. He fed her like a child, but she didn't mind at this point. She hummed her approval. It was real food. It was meat. Chicken, she'd wager. There were vegetables, broccoli, and instant potatoes. But she wasn't picky. This was more than she had had in weeks. She devoured every bite offered to her. It was only when she was finished that Jean fed himself. Merci? She finally said. It was one of the few French words she knew. He smiled happily, though she could not see it. It was just nice that she was grateful. He had given her a can of soda, which was a welcome change from the tap water she had been drinking. It had been quiet for some time. The rain outside was so heavy. It was hard to hear the television over the white noise of the loud patter on the roof and window panes. Monica had been rather close to Jean after supper. She felt rather safe with him. He was polite and careful. He didn't do anything to make her feel uncomfortable. It was nice to meet a man who acted like a civilized human being rather than an animal. I'm an American. That was an odd way to start a conversation. She could feel him look down at her as she rested her head on his chest. I'm only 15. He simply rubbed her arm with the hand he had wrapped around her. He turned the television down so he could hear her better. He was curious about her situation, but wasn't sure how to ask, or if he should anyway. She was offering it on her own now. I live in a small town in Connecticut. I had a pretty average life, really. I had friends, and my biggest worry was getting good grades on my report card and covering up zits. He chuckled a little at her remark. He was taking her seriously, but it was hard to hold back. She didn't seem to mind. The way she had said it was pretty funny. She smiled a little. Sadly, almost. I made a lot of friends online. Some of them were from other countries. I had been talking to a few men. I thought it was so exotic to talk to them. Some were well-mannered. Others were, I suppose, clearly not. I didn't care, though. I liked the attention. Then I met Froggy214. We'd been talking for a year. We exchanged pictures. He sent me presents. We talked via webcam, too. I fell madly in love with him and his voice. He had such a thick accent, and I loved it. She frowned deeply. She had been so enchanted by him that she had dropped her guard. He was the image of perfection to her. He was older than her, which made it even more exciting. He was, at least she thought, much more grown up and mature than the boys her age. He told me how wonderful it was to live in France, and said he wanted me to visit one day, she continued. My parents didn't like that I was talking to men on the internet. They weren't too happy about me having an online boyfriend either. Looking back at my life now, I had it pretty good. I'm not sure why I hated it so much. I guess that's just how teenagers are. We feel like our parents cramp our style and try to break free. I wish I could go back to being that ignorant. She let out a sigh. Froggy 214. He said his name was Jacques. I remember I had a big fight with my parents over... I don't even remember. That's how stupid it was. But Jacques was there for me. He said he could save me from my parents and that we could be together. She paused. She wasn't sure why. It was as if she was waiting for Jean to judge her, though she had no idea how a mute would be able to do that. She could tell he was still looking down at her, and he continued to hold her arm securely. She knew he'd release her if she asked. That was a nice change. He told me that he loved me. He said I was so beautiful. She was a beautiful young lady. Jean thought so. She was very pretty. He could imagine she'd be much prettier with a few more pounds put onto her and a bright and carefree smile. She'd look much healthier then. Jacques hadn't lied about that, he figured. Even if he had lied about everything else to lure the child into his clutches, he weaved some truth in there. France was a nice country, in his opinion, and she was a pretty girl who deserved to be happy. He told me that he wanted to marry me and bring me to France, she explained. I really believed him. I thought it was a dream come true. I'd marry a gorgeous Frenchman, live in Paris, live a glamorous life, and have a perfect family. I guess that sounds pretty stupid now. I don't speak a lick of French, and know nothing about France. He patted her arm reassuringly. It was rather silly and naive of her, but what was done was done. He came for me, she said. He actually flew across the ocean, just for me. I knew it was love then. I snuck out. I didn't tell anybody where I was going. I just packed a bag and ran away from home. I met Jacques, and he was wonderful. We didn't leave the country right away. We went to New York first. He was so romantic. She let out another sad sigh. It was depressing to know how perfect he had been, only to truly be that monster from whom she had fled. He said we would have a big wedding in Notre Dame. He took me out to fancy restaurants and bought me nice things. He was my first, you know? He was just so perfect, patient, gentle, romantic. She scowled. It was all a lie. We flew to Paris, and he brought me to this big building. It was all downhill from there. He wasn't romantic and caring anymore. He made me do disgusting things. Then he began bringing guys in to do things with. I had nowhere to go. I was stuck and vulnerable. Jean's expression darkened a bit. He was angry at this Jacques guy, and he wished he knew more about where he was. He wanted to see this guy put away and punished for what he had done to this child, and probably others. After all, what pimp only had one girl? My parents would get really mad at me if I went home. I don't know the language here. He is going to look for me at some point. I don't know what to do. I'm really scared. Jean moved then, wrapped his arms about her, and gave her a reassuring squeeze. She sucked in a breath, but soon melted in to hug him back. Whoever the stranger was, she liked him. She barely trusted him, but given her previous alternative, she felt enough trust for now. She had no idea what he would even do, or how he could even really help her. For now, he gave her a warm, dry place to stay and a full belly. He didn't seem so bad. Jean released her and took hold of her hands. She looked at them, even if it was just a blur. He formed them into a heart and smiled warmly. She wasn't entirely sure what he was doing at first, but then smiled back when she finally understood. "Thank you," she replied. "Merci." A thunderclap woke Monica from a dead sleep. She barely even remembered doing so. She patted herself and found she was still in her clothes. It paid to be a bit aware, didn't it? She carefully reached over to the body of Jean beside her. He, too, was still in his pajamas. That brought a wave of relief over her. He hadn't taken advantage of her in her sleep. Thank goodness. The sun was up, but the morning was so gray and dismal. It was very cloudy, but it was obviously daytime. Monica couldn't really tell the time at this point. She got up and carefully made her way to the window in the kitchen area, peering at the blurry glass. As miserable as it felt weather-wise, she felt liberated. She was almost happy to see the rain, since it was a rain that could be experienced in freedom. She gasped when she heard the bed creak. Down came the feet of Jean, and he brushed his hair from his face as he came into the kitchen and approached her. He leaned over her and drew a small heart on the fog glass. He took her hand and manipulated her finger to do the same. She couldn't help but giggle a bit. She made a circle next to the hearts, and he put a smiley face. He took his index fingers and pulled her face up into a goofy grin. She pulled away with a laugh. "You're so silly." She could hear his quiet laugh as he moved about her to get the pans for breakfast. It was a treat. He made French toast. How coincidental. It was so perfectly done and just the right sweetness with the butter, syrup, cinnamon sprinkles, powdered sugar, and just an ever so slightly dollop of whipped cream. He truly spoiled her. She made her approval quite clear with those deep moans and hums. It pleased him. He never cooked for anyone normally. It was nice to know he was good at it. Jean was quite generous. He couldn't bear the thought of putting her back in that sleazy dress that Jacques had put her in for his disgusting clientele. He gave her a navy blue turtleneck shirt and a pair of old slacks he felt he could do without. They were a bit small anyway. All the better for Monica. It was cold outside, so he also gave her one of his old sweaters. It wasn't the most beautiful thing, and could have easily been featured on an episode of The Cosby Show with its tackiness, but it did the job. The streets of Paris felt terrific that day. Monica stayed linked to Jean's arm as they walked under his large umbrella through the avenues. She could not see everything clearly, but it didn't matter. He already piqued her interest in what Paris looked like on this side of the walls. She wasn't sure where he was taking her, but she could hear the hustle and bustle of people all over. French was everywhere. At least it was in a very busy public. Suddenly, she felt uncomfortable and gave Jean's shirt a tug. "What about him? Do you think he is looking for me? I know who he is and what he looks like. Won't he come after me?" He pulled her close and held her protectively. He wanted to make it clear that he would look after her so long as she was in his care. She said nothing more on the matter, so he assumed that she understood. They stopped at a cafe where he ordered a coffee for himself and a cup of fresh hot cocoa for her. She rather liked this, though she became visibly jittery. Oh, right. He had been charming before. He took her away to that horrible sex den of his. It made Jean uncomfortable as well. He did not want to be associated with such a beast. That was not the sort of intention he had for poor Monica. In due time, Jean took her into another building. Again, everyone was speaking French, and it sounded busy. However, the smell was different, and things seemed a bit more serious and cold. "Puis-je aider, monsieur?" a man's voice asked. Obviously, she heard no reply from Jean. There must have been some communication, though, as the man approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Je suis Jean de Labo. Parles-tu français, cher?" I'm sorry," she replied anxiously. She took a step back and practically hid herself behind Jean. "I don't understand." She felt Jean's comforting hands rest on her shoulder, and he gave her a reassuring squeeze. The officer went back to the others, and more French was spoken between them. Jean did his best to communicate to them, but even he was having trouble. Not everyone understood sign language, so he understood Monica's frustrations as well. A woman finally approached and smiled. "What is your name?" Her accent was understandably thick. She spoke English, but it was obvious that she didn't do so often enough. Still, it was something. "I'm Monica. Where are we?" "You are at the police station," she replied. "I'm Officer Bonvoy. You can call me Heather if you like." A police station! That was wonderful news. "I'm an American!" she shouted, though she didn't intend to be so loud. "Have you gotten separated from your parents?" "Yes and no," she replied. "My parents don't know I'm here. They're still in the United States. I was brought here. Can I go home? I can't see. I got something in my eyes, and now I can't see." Some more French was exchanged between the officers, and Officer Heather placed a hand on her back. "We will take care of you, Monica. I just need you to come with me and tell me what happened. We'll get you home as soon as possible." She let out a sigh of relief. She turned and gave Jean a firm hug. He was glad to return it. "Thank you so much, sir," she said to him, realizing she had never gotten his name. He responded by taking her hands and manipulating them into that heart shape again. She giggled a little. He did the same with his hands and placed them against hers. As simple as it was, it somehow amused the both of them. He placed a hand on top of her head and mussed her hair and kissed her forehead. When he left her, she suddenly felt cold, naked, and vulnerable. Even Heather's guidance didn't really replace the void left by Jean. She couldn't tell if he was there or gone, but he wasn't right upon her anymore, and she hated that. Monica told Officer Heather everything she possibly could. Her parents were called, and for the first time in several weeks, she was able to hear their voices and talk to them. She expected them to be very angry. In contrast, they were so glad to hear her voice, and especially glad to hear that she was alive. They had been worried. They just wanted her home. Home she would go. She was seen by a medic. Her blindness, thankfully, was temporary, and her eyes were properly washed out and treated. It was only a matter of time now. Then came Mr. Kempson from the embassy. From there, it was smooth sailing and a long-awaited trip back to the United States and her family. The whole ordeal had definitely made her rethink her life at home. Jean, the name of the man that had helped her, saved her from making a huge mistake. It was Jean. She often wondered about him. She also wondered what he looked like. She remembered some things about his appearance, the things she could feel. She'd never be able to pick him out on the street. It irked her sometimes, though she told herself many times that it didn't matter. She was home now. She had her regular friends. She could go back to her normal life, yet not so normal. It wasn't the same life that she had left behind before her endeavor. Things were different now. She had mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, she wished she had never had to go through such a traumatic thing. Yet, if she hadn't, she wouldn't have realized how good she had it before, and how good she could make it now. She rarely talked about him and what he had done to her. She wanted to put him as far away from her mind as possible. Instead, she talked about Jean whenever it came up. If she had to remember that horrible time in Paris, she'd saturate it with images and thoughts about him. At least then, it was pleasant enough to endure. He'd been the one she needed, even in her dreams. When the nightmares would arise, it was this mysterious man that would put a stop to them. In due time, normalcy resumed, and Monica was worried about typical things again. Would she get a B in geometry? Would a guy ask her to the school dance? Would she have a date for the prom? Would she make the cheerleading team? What sort of car would she get after getting her license? What college would she attend after graduation? The journey to growing up. Had so much really changed in 5 years? Monica couldn't really remember. The trip had been one she was unsure she wanted to take. She had almost refused. She was somewhat glad she hadn't. Looking into the window of the Parisian bakery made her realize that she indeed wanted to be here. She was on her own terms now. "Looks delicious, doesn't it?" she asked, as one of her classmates came alongside her. "En français, s'il vous plaît," Vanessa teased, waving her hand mockingly as she pretended to be the French instructor. Monica gave her a playful push. "Oh, don't even start," she laughed. "Well, you remember what Miss LeBlanc said before we got here." "I remember," Monica sighed. "She said that not everyone could speak English and we were to test our French. Trust me, nobody knows this better than me in this class." Vanessa looked at the goodies in the window. "I thought you hated Paris." "I don't hate Paris. There are just some things that I hate," she corrected. "I thought I'd be uncomfortable coming." "I don't, though. I actually feel good." "We have to meet up with the others." Monica was rather glad Vanessa had swiftly changed the subject. It wasn't like there was anything to worry about. He was no longer her concern. But it was still better to put him out of her mind. "Race you." Before Monica could reply, Vanessa took off running down the crowded sidewalk. "Vanessa!" she called after her and began to run. She got off to a rather clumsy start. Vanessa had gotten a nice head start on her, and Monica was hoping not to lose her. Luckily, she knew where they were supposed to meet up, but she didn't necessarily want to be anywhere in Paris alone. She rounded the corner and zigzagged about to look for Vanessa's bright orange scarf. She thought she might have spotted it, but lost her immediately as she ran into someone. Hard. "Pardon-moi!" she shouted as she put her hands out and placed them on the chest of the person in front of her. She raised her eyes to see a man in white makeup, target red cheeks, and black lip color. He had a black beret on his head and was dressed in a black and white striped turtleneck and black slacks. A mime! He was quite a nice-looking fellow. "Désolé," she breathed out. He stared at her for a long moment before growing a bright smile and holding up his hands. They were covered with white gloves. She smiled a bit and gave him an acknowledging nod. He tipped his hat as she scuttled about him and began to run again. She only got a few feet before she stopped and turned around. She wasn't sure why. She just felt compelled to do so. She watched the mime a while. He was doing the typical things, the box, the rope, things one could expect from a mime. He turned around and noticed her watching him. He smiled and brought his hands together to form a heart. Without realizing it, Monica mimicked him. "Jean?" she whispered under her breath. He was turning around, and she felt the oomph in her chest. "Jean!" He turned and looked surprised. He pointed to himself. Sure, she got a few other looks, but he expressly pointed to himself. She felt her heart leap into her throat. That was him. That was Jean. Her Jean. She hurried back to him and ran into his chest and held him. He accepted this strange attack and hugged her back. He had to be her Jean. Otherwise, the most patient mime in all of France. "Do you remember me?" she asked hopefully as she looked up at him. He smiled down at her and pulled back, taking her hands to form them into that familiar heart. He did so himself and placed his next to hers, like he had done that day. He then placed a hand on her chest and mouthed her name. It was all he could do. He was, after all, mute. She nodded. That's right. I'm Monica. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest and smiled thoughtfully. And you're Jean. Jean placed his hand over hers and nodded. He remembered her. She was older now, but he knew her face. He straightened up and offered her his arm, like a gentleman, puffing out his chest and growing a large smile, making the ordeal exaggerated and comical. Monica duly laughed and took hold of his arm. Ah, she remembered when she had held on to him on that long walk like this. He had escorted her then, and he did so again now. She'd found him, her silent Parisian prince. He was the reason she had decided to face all her anxieties. He was the reason she had returned to Paris. She knew finding him was like finding a needle in a haystack. She would have likely never found him, no matter how hard she looked. Yet there he was. She had found him by chance, just as he had found her by chance back then, those 5 years ago. Finally, they were together again. She found him. Paris had once been her dream turned nightmare, and now Paris was a nightmare turned dream once again, and she had come face to face yet again with the man who had made that all possible. La fin. Okay, so before anybody says anything, let me just say that the last time I actually had to speak French was in high school, and that was like in the 1990s, late 1990s. So it's been a while. So you're probably saying, well, Ravyn, why'd you put French in here if you have no clue what the hell you're talking about? Well, when I wrote this, I didn't exactly plan to be reading it aloud. I honestly thought it would just be read by other people. So if I've butchered some French, I'm really sorry. I actually had a friend who did speak French, and he helped me out so that I didn't have to depend on Google Translate and Babelfish and all that, because, you know, they aren't always correct. So, so that's kind of why the French is kind of weird. My pronunciation is weird, I know, and while I know some of what I was saying, I don't quite know how everything else was supposed to be said. And by the way, if by chance, unless I can edit it all out, if you hear these little meows, that would be Kiko, our cat that we inherited from my grandmother when she passed. And he's a bit of a chatterbox since we've brought him here. But Kiko's story is not really part of this story. I just wanted to say, you know, if you heard the meowing, that's who was doing it. I actually remember back when I was a teen, and this was back when the internet was a new thing, and it was how everybody wanted to get there. And everybody was talking about being careful about the people you talk to online, which is still relevant. But, you know, remember, when I was little, we didn't have internet and stuff. So, like in the 90s, when we finally got our first connection, that was always the warning, you know, you never know who anybody is online. And as a teenage girl, it was always kind of cool to have some of the older guys flirt with you. I've had it happen to me, you know. It was nothing majorly dirty or anything. It was just a bunch of nice guys. And I actually had some nice friends. I had some nice guys from, like, different countries who would just be nice to talk to. Nothing dirty or anything. Then you had those few, of course, that are predators. But I know that's like a big worry. And I kind of drew on that for this story. Of course, you know, I wasn't kidnapped or a runaway or anything like that. But I know that, like, this is the sad truth of sex trafficking is out there, especially with young girls, young, naive girls. So it was definitely kind of it was definitely a dark story, and that's why it's in the Dark Collection. And the the title is in French, and if you want to translate it exactly, it's The Guardian of Secrets, or The Guardian of the Secret, which was the only way I could translate what I wanted the English title to be, which was The Secret Keeper. I wanted to be cool, so I'm like, oh, let me just do a French title, and so yeah, it's a French title, but it is in English. And I actually have done it a few other times for other projects, because, I don't know, I guess I'm just weird that way. But yeah, for the actual title, English translation, it was supposed to be The Secret Keeper. Even though, like I said, it translates the same. The Secret Keeper was Le Gardien du Secret, and then, of course, when you translate it back, it ends up being the Guardian of the Secret. So it's like, no, that wasn't what I wanted, but close as I'm going to get. So now you know. So, trivia. What's the English translation for Le Gardien du Secret? The correct answer is The Secret Keeper. Aside from the cat, like I said, if I can't edit the cat meows out, aside from the cat, you'll probably hear the clacking. You probably heard it in the end of the Black Train. If you didn't see the vlog, then basic update is we moved into a new forever home, and until I can get some new ceiling fans that don't make noises, I have a fan in my bedroom that makes this clacking noise. I've had the air conditioner off during this one, but you'll probably end up hearing the air conditioner in some of the future ones. So that's what I have to say about this story and reading this story. It's not one of my favorites, but it just felt like something I had to write at the time, and now that I've had some time away from it and reading it again for the Ravyn Reads, it's like, this was kind of dark, and which was how it was supposed to be. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that you will continue to enjoy Ravyn Reads.